the beginning of the Viking Age, a period of Scandinavian expansion that would reshape the political, cultural, and religious landscape of Europe. On June 8, 793 AD, a group of Viking raiders descended upon the monastery of Lindisfarne, a small island off the northeast coast of England. The attack was swift, brutal, and devastating. The raiders looted the monastery, killing monks, desecrating sacred relics, and carrying off treasures and slaves. The event sent shockwaves across Christian Europe, as it was not merely an attack on a religious institution but a symbolic assault on the spiritual heart of Anglo-Saxon England. Lindisfarne, also known as the Holy Island, was a center of Christian learning and spirituality, home to the revered Saint Cuthbert and the famous Lindisfarne Gospels. The raid was recorded in contemporary sources such as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and the letters of Alcuin of York, who expressed profound grief and horror at the sacrilege. The attack on Lindisfarne was a turning point in history, signaling the beginning of a new era of Viking expansion and conflict. It demonstrated the vulnerability of coastal communities and the effectiveness of Viking tactics, which relied on speed, surprise, and overwhelming force. This essay will explore the historical context of the raid, the event itself, and its far-reaching consequences, shedding light on why the Battle of Lindisfarne remains a pivotal moment in the history of medieval Europe. To understand the significance of the Battle of Lindisfarne, it is essential to examine the historical context in which it occurred. The late 8th century was a time of profound change and uncertainty in Europe. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of England were divided and often at odds with one another, making them vulnerable to external threats. Northumbria, where Lindisfarne was located, was one of the most powerful kingdoms, but it was also politically unstable. The monastery of Lindisfarne, founded by Saint Aidan in 635 AD, had become a center of Christian learning and spirituality. Under the leadership of Saint Cuthbert, the monastery gained a reputation for holiness and scholarship, attracting pilgrims and scholars from across Europe. The Lindisfarne Gospels, an illuminated manuscript of extraordinary beauty, were produced here, showcasing the artistic and intellectual achievements of the monastery. Meanwhile, in Scandinavia, the Norse people were undergoing significant changes. Overpopulation, political instability, and a desire for wealth and adventure drove them to explore and raid beyond their homelands. The Vikings were skilled seafarers, using their iconic longships to navigate rivers and seas with remarkable speed and precision. Their raids were characterized by surprise attacks, looting, and often brutal violence. The attack on Lindisfarne was not the first Viking raid in history, but it was the first to target a major Christian center. The raid demonstrated the vulnerability of monasteries, which were repositories of wealth and lacked military defenses. It also marked the beginning of a new era of Viking expansion, as the Norse people began to raid, trade, and settle across vast areas of Europe. The historical context of the raid helps to explain why it was so shocking and transformative, setting the stage for centuries of conflict and cultural exchange. The raid on Lindisfarne occurred on June 8, 793 AD, and was a devastating blow to the monastery and the wider Christian community. The attack was sudden and brutal, catching the monks completely off guard. The Viking raiders, arriving in their longships, quickly overwhelmed the monastery. They looted the church, stealing precious religious artifacts, gold, and silver. Many of the monks were killed, while others were taken as slaves. The monastery was left in ruins, and the sacred relics of Saint Cuthbert were desecrated. The raid was recorded in several contemporary sources, including the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which described it as a great slaughter and a terrible portent. The writings of Alcuin of York, a prominent scholar and advisor to Charlemagne, provide further insight into the event. Alcuin, who was from Northumbria, expressed profound shock and grief at the attack. In a letter to the Bishop of Lindisfarne, he wrote, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. Behold, the church of Saint Cuthbert spattered with the blood of the priests of God, despoiled of all its ornaments." Alcuin's letters highlight the psychological impact of the raid, which was seen as an affront to God and a sign of divine wrath. The attack on Lindisfarne was not just a raid for wealth, it was a symbolic assault on the spiritual heart of Anglo-Saxon England. The raid demonstrated the effectiveness of Viking tactics, which relied on speed, surprise, and overwhelming force. It also marked the beginning of a new era of Viking expansion, as the Norse people began to raid, trade, and settle across vast areas of Europe. The raid on Lindisfarne was a turning point in history, signaling the beginning of the Viking Age and setting the stage for centuries of conflict and cultural exchange. The raid on Lindisfarne had far-reaching consequences for both the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and the wider Christian world. The attack sent shockwaves across Europe, as it demonstrated the vulnerability of coastal communities and the effectiveness of Viking tactics. Monasteries and churches, which had previously been seen as inviolable, were now at risk. The raid prompted a wave of fear and uncertainty, as people began to question why God had allowed such a sacrilegious act to occur. In the wake of the raid, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms began to take defensive measures. Fortifications were built, and efforts were made to strengthen coastal defenses. At the same time, the Church sought to explain the raid as a punishment for sin and a call to repentance. This dual response, military and spiritual, reflects the complex ways in which medieval societies dealt with crises. The raid on Lindisfarne also marked the beginning of the Viking Age, a period of Scandinavian expansion that lasted for nearly 3 centuries. The Vikings would go on to raid, trade, and settle across vast areas of Europe, from the British Isles to the Mediterranean and beyond. They established settlements in places like Dublin, York, and Normandy, and their influence can still be seen in the languages, cultures, and genetic makeup of these regions. The raid also had a lasting impact on the cultural memory of the British Isles. It became a symbol of the Viking threat and was remembered in chronicles, poems, and legends. The event is often romanticized in modern literature and media, contributing to the enduring image of the Vikings as fierce warriors and ruthless raiders. The legacy of the raid on Lindisfarne is a reminder of the profound impact that the Vikings had on European history. Their raids, trade networks, and settlements helped to shape the medieval world and laid the foundations for the modern nations of Europe.